Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The question echoed in my mind, is someone watching me? It wasn't a random thought. It wasn't paranoia, not yet. I hadn't yet let the fear settle in, but it lingered at the edges, tugging at my awareness. The thing was, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, just out of sight. Watching. The small apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The walls, cracked and weathered by time, had always been a comfort in their familiarity. The creaks of the wooden floors, the draft that slipped through the edges of the windows, it was all a part of the old, comfortable rhythm I'd gotten used to. But recently, that rhythm had shifted. I remember the first time I noticed it. I was sitting at my desk, the soft hum of my old computer the only noise in the room. But then there was the sound. A faint scrape. Not from outside, not from the pipes like I thought at first, but from somewhere closer. Somewhere inside. The room seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, I held mine too. At first, I tried to rationalize it. The apartment had always had its odd sounds, the kind of noises you learn to ignore. The building was old, after all. The wind was always making strange noises when it whistled through the cracks. But this was different. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the same dull light from the dim lamp on my desk, the shadows stretching long on the walls. I returned to my work, but I couldn't focus. Every small sound, a rustle, a shuffle, distracted me. The quiet was suffocating. The room was closing in on me. It was just a building, I told myself. Just an old building. But the feeling didn't go away. It crept up on me, tugging at the edges of my thoughts until it couldn't be ignored any longer. By evening, the tension had begun to mount. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow. A chill ran up my spine when I stood to check the hallway outside my apartment. The low hum of the streetlights seeped through the cracks in the window blinds, casting faint, jagged lines across the floor. The hall was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation. The sense that something, was just out of reach, hiding in the shadows. I had no idea how long it had been there, this feeling. Perhaps it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. But now that it was there, I couldn't forget it. It lingered, like the echo of an unspoken word, never fully coming into focus. It wasn't just the apartment. It wasn't just the walls. It was everywhere. The sounds in the city outside, the strange flicker of the streetlights. A whisper on the edge of my hearing, always there, just beyond the reach of my understanding. It wasn't a rational fear, I knew that. But the more I thought about it, the more real it felt. Like someone, was watching, waiting. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it was just the stress, the loneliness. But even as I convinced myself, the whispers grew louder. It started with the wind, but now it felt like something else. Something worse. The shadows didn't just stretch across the walls anymore. They moved. The days blurred together, each one a slight variation on the last, but the feeling, the presence, remained constant, persistent. It was no longer a mere whisper in the back of my mind, it was becoming a fact. Something was out there. Watching. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The air felt thicker, almost as if it had weight to it. Even the familiar sounds of the neighborhood seemed off. The old man who lived 2 floors down, who always whistled the same tune on his way to the corner shop, had gone quiet. The kids who used to laugh and shout as they played in the alleyway outside hadn't been around for days. And then there was the smell. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the usual scent of damp wood or old stone that clung to the walls. But one evening, as I was sitting in my chair, staring at the empty walls, I caught a faint, almost imperceptible smell. A sharp, metallic odor, like the tang of iron, mixed with something sickly sweet. It lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I didn't know what it was, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to shake it off. My mind was playing tricks on me. I was just tired, I told myself. The stress of work, of everything, this was just my brain looking for something to focus on. But the smell didn't fade. It only grew stronger. The nights were the worst. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the apartment seemed to change. The familiar shadows grew longer, twisting into shapes that weren't quite right. At times, I thought I saw movement from the corner of my eye, but when I turned my head, the room was empty. It was one of those nights, just past midnight, when I first heard it. The sound. At first, I thought it was just the creak of the old pipes. But no! It was something more deliberate, something that had a rhythm to it, slow, steady, and unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps weren't coming from the hallway, they were coming from inside the apartment. They sounded like they were moving from the kitchen to the living room, slow and deliberate. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. My feet felt heavy, as though the floor was pulling me back. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Only the soft ticking of the clock in the corner of the room filled the void. But the silence was worse than the sound. The absence of noise pressed against my chest, squeezing the air out of me. I had to check. I had to know if there was someone, something, there. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I walked down the narrow hallway. Each step seemed louder than the last, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I reached the doorway to the living room. The faint light from the street outside filtered through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the room. There was nothing. No one. But as I stood there, staring into the dark, I noticed something else. Something small, almost insignificant. The curtains. They weren't still. The faintest breeze had caused them to stir, and they swayed gently back and forth. I hadn't opened the window. A chill ran down my spine. I turned quickly, my pulse hammering in my neck. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I felt it in my bones. Someone was in the room with me. But the room was empty. The footsteps. The smell. The feeling of being watched. It was too much. My thoughts spiraled, swirling like smoke in my mind. Am I losing my mind? But no, this was real. I wasn't imagining things. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. But something held me back. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something more, something deeper. The longer I stayed in this apartment, the more it felt like it was becoming part of me. Its walls, its creaks, its shadows, they weren't just things I lived with anymore. They were part of me. And I was becoming part of it. The next morning, I woke to find a strange mark on the floor. A dark stain, like something had been dragged across it, right where I had stood the night before. I couldn't remember seeing it before. I tried to clean it, but no matter how hard I scrubbed, it wouldn't come off. It was like it had seeped into the wood itself. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a building. This place was alive. I couldn't stop thinking about the mark. It wasn't just dirt or some stain that could be wiped away. It felt wrong. Every time I looked at it, my stomach twisted into a knot. The dark, smeared pattern stretched out like fingers creeping along the floorboards, as if whatever had caused it had been there, just beyond my sight, watching me. I spent hours cleaning the stain, but it was futile. The more I scrubbed, the more it spread. It wasn't just the wood, it seemed to be sinking into the very air, poisoning the room. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in around me, as if they were pressing down with a weight I couldn't escape. I should have left. I knew that. Something in my mind screamed at me to just walk away, to leave the apartment and never look back. But it was like the building was holding me in place. The windows had become prison bars, the door an unbreakable barrier. I couldn't leave, and I couldn't stay. It was as though the apartment was feeding on my fear, growing stronger the longer I remained. That night, the sounds came again. But this time, they were louder, more distinct. I could hear them clearly now, footsteps, but not just one set. No, this time, there were two. One was heavy, deliberate, dragging its feet like something wounded. The other was light, almost playful, moving with a strange rhythm that made my skin crawl. The sound of them echoed through the apartment, bouncing off the walls, vibrating in my chest. They moved in patterns, shifting direction as if they were circling me. I could hear them in the hallway, just outside my door, then they would move to the living room, pause, and start again. I couldn't sit still anymore. My hands were trembling, and I had to force myself to take shallow, steady breaths. My body ached to run, but I didn't know where to go. There was no escape. I needed to know what was happening. I had to face whatever this was. I stood, my legs weak, but my mind clear with a single, desperate thought. I have to see it. The light from the street filtered through the curtains, casting strange shadows across the room. I watched as they swayed, twitching slightly as if they too were aware of the presence lurking in the corners. The sound of the footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. It felt like the calm before the storm. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew whatever was coming would be worse than anything I had yet encountered. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway stretched out before me, eerily quiet, as if the world had suddenly gone still. The faint light from the outside barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows along the walls. I couldn't help but feel like they were watching me. Watching from the corners, from the dark. The footsteps started again, but this time they were louder. The heavy ones, dragging across the floor, came from the end of the hallway, from the direction of the kitchen. The lighter ones followed, quicker, more erratic, as though they were playing a game. I moved toward them, my heart pounding in my chest. The air seemed to thicken around me, every step feeling like it took an eternity. I reached the kitchen, and I saw it. The door was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling from the cracks. The temperature dropped, the air turning cold and thick, like winter had suddenly descended upon me. I pushed the door open. Nothing. I felt a rush of confusion, a wave of dizziness, and the sound of my own breathing filled the space. The room looked ordinary, No sign of movement, no presence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was here. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I whirled around, panic flooding my senses. I could feel the presence, feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see it. There was something in the room now, something I couldn't quite place, but it was there, pressing in on me from all sides. The shadows grew deeper, darker, as if the very walls were closing in. I turned and saw something in the far corner of the kitchen, a shape, shifting and flickering, like it couldn't quite hold its form. It was moving toward me, slow but steady, growing more defined with every step. I couldn't breathe. My heart raced as I backed up, my legs shaking beneath me. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The shape in the corner grew clearer, and I could see it now, her. A figure, pale and gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her bones. Her hair was wild, untamed, hanging in clumps around her face, which seemed almost human, almost, but not quite. Her mouth hung open, stretched into a grin, exposing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark as pitch, but I could feel them locked onto mine. She wasn't moving like a person. She was twitching, jerking, and her body contorted in unnatural ways, like a broken marionette. She was closer now, standing just inches from me, her breath cold against my skin. I could hear the footsteps again, the dragging ones, getting closer from behind. I tried to scream, but my voice was trapped, stuck in my throat. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare into the face of something that wasn't human. She reached out, her long, bony fingers grazing my cheek, and in that moment, the world seemed to crack. The apartment, the walls, the shadows, they all seemed to warp, distort. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. The kitchen was empty. The air was still, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't unsee her. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I was afraid to even blink, afraid that when I opened my eyes again, she'd be standing there. The woman, the thing, had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the image of her face, her hollow eyes, her twisted grin, was burned into my mind. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the presence. I sat in my chair, staring at the now empty kitchen, the shadows stretching and shifting in the dim light. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside seemed amplified, a warning, a signal that something was still there, lurking, waiting for me to let my guard down. It didn't make sense. None of it did. How could she have just vanished like that? Was it a hallucination? A dream? No. It had felt too real. Too tangible. I could still feel her cold fingers on my skin, like an imprint that wouldn't fade. I tried to shake the thoughts away, but they clung to me like cobwebs. What do I do now? The first thing I did was check the apartment again, from top to bottom. I needed to make sure there were no signs of anyone else, no other presence, no clues to what had really happened. I checked every closet, every corner, every window. I even inspected the walls, searching for something, anything, that could explain what I had seen. But there was nothing. The apartment was the same as it had always been. Old, creaky, and suffocatingly quiet. No broken windows, no footprints in the dust. It was as though the nightmare had never occurred at all. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it, deep in my bones. Something was watching. Something was waiting. I was on edge all day. I couldn't go outside. The thought of leaving the apartment, even for a moment, filled me with dread. Every step I took in the apartment felt like I was walking on a tightrope, every shadow a threat, every sound an omen. I couldn't escape it. It had taken root in me. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to leave. The apartment, the city, it didn't matter. I needed to escape the thing that had taken hold of my mind. But as I packed my things, preparing to leave, something stopped me. It was the smell. It was faint at first, just a whisper in the air. The same metallic, sickly sweet odor I had noticed before. It wasn't just in the kitchen this time, it was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the floors, in the air itself. It was suffocating, overwhelming. I couldn't escape it. I turned to leave, but that's when I saw it. The mark. It was back. Larger now, its tendrils stretching across the floor, creeping toward the walls as if it was trying to spread. It looked like something had been dragged through it, like something had been pulled across the floor. I stepped back, my heart racing. I knew what I was seeing wasn't right. The mark had been gone, but now it was here again. And this time, it was alive. I backed away slowly, my eyes glued to the mark. Something moved within it. Something shifting, writhing, like it was alive. The shadows around it seemed to deepen, and the air became colder. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, but growing louder, clearer, until it was all I could hear. It wasn't a voice. It was something else, something low, guttural, and inhuman. A sound that scraped at my mind, making everything feel wrong, twisted. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the things I was leaving behind. I didn't care about anything except getting away from the apartment, from the mark, from the thing that had attached itself to me. I ran down the hall, through the door, and out into the street. But even then, it didn't stop. The feeling that something was watching me never left. The streets were empty, the city silent, but I could feel it, it was still there. I looked behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was no one. No one except the shadows that stretched across the empty streets. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. That whatever I had left behind in that apartment hadn't just stayed there. It had followed me. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Whatever this was, whatever she was, it was coming for me. I didn't sleep for the next few nights. I couldn't. No matter how far I ran, how many steps I took, the dread followed me. It clung to me like a shadow, slipping into every corner of my mind, suffocating every thought. The streets, the buildings, the people, they all felt like part of the same nightmare. The world around me twisted, contorted, until I couldn't tell where reality ended and the terror began. The smell of decay never left me. It lingered on my clothes, in my hair, like I had become one with whatever had been in that apartment. I could still feel the cold fingers on my skin, still hear the whispers scraping against the walls of my mind. And worst of all, I could feel her presence, just beyond my sight, always watching, always waiting. I tried to talk to people. I tried to explain, to make them understand what had happened, but no one listened. They thought I was crazy, thought I had finally snapped. I couldn't blame them. How could I expect anyone to believe me? How could I explain that the fear wasn't just in my head? That it wasn't just some bad dream? It was real. I moved into a new place. It was a tiny apartment on the edge of town, away from everything, away from the familiar streets I used to walk. I told myself it would be different here, that the thing couldn't follow me. But every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls, felt like a reminder that it was still out there, still waiting for me to slip up. I couldn't escape it. Then, one night, as I sat in the dark of my new apartment, staring at the walls, I heard it. The whisper. It was faint at first, just a murmur in the air, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was that same low, guttural sound I had heard in the apartment, only now it seemed to come from all around me. It didn't come from any specific direction, but it was everywhere. It was in the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. The whispers were so loud now, I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it didn't stop. It was inside me, tearing through my mind, digging its claws into my very thoughts. And then, in the middle of the chaos, I heard something else. A voice. Clearer, sharper, cutting through the whispers. You're never safe. The words sent a shock through my body. I froze, my blood running cold. I looked around the room, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. There couldn't be. I was alone, but I could feel it. I felt her. She was close. She was always close. I ran again. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay anywhere. I couldn't outrun her. I knew that now, but I had to try. I found myself walking aimlessly through the city, the streets unfamiliar and dark. The buildings around me seemed to lean in, pressing in on me with each step I took. The whispers followed me, fading in and out like a sick lullaby. It was then that I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows of an alleyway, half hidden in the darkness. For a split second, I thought it was her, but then I realized something was different. This was not the woman I had seen in the apartment. This was a man. He stood motionless, his back to me, his head down, as if he was waiting for something. Something about him felt wrong. There was an unnatural stillness to his form, like he wasn't breathing, wasn't moving. I couldn't look away. My legs froze, my body rooted to the spot as I watched him. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he slowly turned around. The first thing I noticed was the eyes. Empty. Hollow. Like two black holes. He smiled. You're running, but you'll never escape. The words were soft, barely a whisper, but they hit me like a physical blow. I backed away, my heart racing. But he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I turned and fled again, my breath ragged as I sprinted through the city streets. My mind was a blur. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All I could think about was getting away. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. But no matter how far I went, I could still feel them, the whispers, the presence. They were always with me. And then I stopped. In the middle of the street, I stopped. The panic, the fear, it all came crashing down at once. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't run forever. I turned around, standing still in the empty street, the world around me eerily silent. The air was thick, suffocating, like something was pressing down on me. And then, from the darkness, I heard her voice again. You can't hide from me. You belong to me. I dropped to my knees, my hands shaking as I pressed them against my ears. But it didn't stop. It never stopped. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just in my head. This wasn't just fear. It was real. The cold that gripped me in the middle of the street felt like a vice. The air around me was no longer just heavy with silence. It had become thick, palpable, like it was trying to swallow me whole. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, each pulse reverberating in my skull, each breath coming harder than the last. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were louder now, sharper, almost like they were forming words, but the words weren't meant for me. They were meant for something else, something far darker. And the closer I got to the alley, the clearer it became. I tried to move, tried to drag myself away from the presence that was pulling me in, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the street itself had become sticky, pulling at my feet, holding me in place. You think you can escape? The voice came from behind me, soft but unmistakable. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. I could feel her there, just beyond the corner of my vision, waiting, watching. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I forced myself to take a step, then another, and another. But each movement felt like I was walking through molasses, each inch dragging me deeper into her world. But then, there was a change. The ground beneath my feet shifted. The street, the city, it didn't feel the same anymore. The buildings that had once loomed around me now seemed to close in, their walls curling inward, like they were trying to trap me in their shadows. The street lights flickered overhead, casting long, twitching shadows across the pavement. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but my voice was lost in the thick air. It was swallowed before it even left my lips. I stumbled, almost falling, but caught myself against the nearest lamppost. And then I looked up. The alley that had been just a few steps behind me was no longer there. The world had changed. The familiar street, the one I had once walked without thought, had twisted into something unrecognizable. The alley now stretched infinitely, disappearing into a darkness that swallowed every trace of light. The sky above was no longer the faint blue I had seen earlier, but a deep, black void, like the night itself had been pulled too close to the earth. There were no stars. No moon. Just blackness. It's not over, you know. The voice was close now, too close. I turned, my body betraying me, but the street behind me was empty. The figure, the one that had been lurking just beyond my reach, was gone. But I could still feel her. I could still feel the coldness of her presence crawling up my spine, creeping under my skin like a poison. I shook my head, trying to clear it, trying to focus on the reality of the situation. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. This had to be a dream. A hallucination. I forced my legs to move again. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know what was happening, but I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay in one place. If I stopped, I would never be able to leave. The street was empty, so empty that it almost felt like I was the only person left in the world. No cars. No people. Only the dark, the whispers, and the suffocating silence. I looked over my shoulder again. Nothing. But when I turned back, my breath caught in my throat. The woman, it was standing at the end of the alley. She was facing away from me, but I knew it was her. I could feel it. That sickening, suffocating presence. Her shadow stretched across the alley like it had grown too large for her body. She turned slowly, deliberately, as if she knew I was watching. And then, with a single movement, she stepped forward. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I ran faster than I had ever run before. My body ached, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty street, a rhythmic pounding that only heightened the terror building in my chest. The alley behind me was still there. Still just as dark. Still just as empty. But I couldn't outrun her. I knew I couldn't. And then, the whispers changed. They became sharper, more distinct. "You're running out of time." I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't a warning. It was a countdown. I reached the end of the street and stopped, gasping for air. The city around me felt distorted, its very edges curling in on themselves. The buildings tilted at unnatural angles, the sky pressing down on the ground like the world itself was suffocating. And that's when I saw it. The mark. The mark that had appeared in my apartment. The one that had been alive. It was on the ground in front of me, its black tendrils stretching out, reaching for me like they had been waiting for me all along. It pulsed with a sickening, rhythmic beat. I could feel it in my chest, in my head. It was drawing me in, pulling me closer. The whispers grew louder, becoming a roar in my ears, drowning out everything else. And I realized then, it wasn't just her. It wasn't just a woman. This thing, this force, it had been here all along. It had been waiting for me to find it. Waiting for me to come to it. Waiting for me to belong to it. I stepped forward, drawn to it, unable to stop myself. But as my foot touched the mark, everything changed. The world shattered. Have you ever found yourself in a place that feels too quiet? Too still? As if something or someone is waiting for you to notice? The moment I stepped off the beaten path, leaving the familiar roads behind, I felt it. That subtle shift, like an invisible hand brushing against my spine. It wasn't just the forest surrounding me, dark and dense, swallowing the light and suffocating the sounds of the world. It was more. It was the land itself, as if it were aware of my presence. Watching me. Waiting. I didn't know why I had come here. Maybe it was the promise of answers, or perhaps I just needed to escape from everything that had once made sense. The job, the responsibilities, the expectations. It had all become too much. But even as I took that first step, there was a tug in my chest, a gnawing feeling deep in my gut that told me I shouldn't be here. But I had no choice. I had made my decision. The trees towered above me, their gnarled branches twisted into shapes that felt almost unnatural. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, and it smelled like damp earth and decaying leaves. I pushed forward, each step dragging more weight behind it. The further I walked, the quieter it became, until even the sounds of my own footsteps seemed muffled by the oppressive silence. And then it began. It started as a faint rustling in the underbrush, a slight shift in the air. I paused, held my breath. Nothing. I told myself it was the wind. The trees, shifting. The forest was old, ancient, and in places like this, nature has its own way of breathing. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. The trees around me had changed. Their shadows, once mere extensions of the foliage, now seemed to stretch longer, twisting into unnatural shapes. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, too fast to catch, but enough to make my heart skip. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The path ahead of me narrowed, and as I walked, the familiar sounds of the forest grew distant, replaced by an eerie stillness. The air seemed to grow colder, but not in the way you'd expect from the night. It was a cold that sunk deeper, past my skin, into my bones. It was the kind of cold that made you question whether it was the weather at all. I could feel it now, the weight of the eyes on me. Not just the forest, but something more, a presence, lurking just out of sight. Something older, something that had been here long before I ever set foot in this place. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. It was indistinct, the words slipping in and out of my hearing. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but this wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too clear. I froze. The whispering continued, growing louder, but still just out of reach. It felt like it was coming from the very trees, from the earth beneath my feet. I couldn't tell if it was the forest itself speaking, or something far worse, something waiting for me to understand. "Come closer," the voice said. I shivered despite the heat in my chest. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body caught in the gravity of the voice. It was almost comforting, but something deep inside me screamed that I should run. Run as far as I could. But I didn't. I couldn't. I took a step forward, then another, each one feeling heavier than the last. It was as if the path had been waiting for me all along, its dark edges closing in behind me. I could feel the forest, the darkness, pushing me forward. The deeper I went, the harder it became to breathe. The air grew thick, making each inhalation feel like I was suffocating. And then it happened. A sudden rustle in the bushes behind me. My heart skipped. I whipped around, but saw nothing. Just trees. Empty branches reaching out like fingers. I wasn't alone. I could hear them now, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just beyond the edge of my sight. Not just one set, but many. The weight of them pressing in from all sides, getting closer, but still never seen. "You're lost," the voice whispered again, this time clearer. Louder. It was right behind me now, and I could feel it, a presence standing just out of my line of sight. I started running, my feet stumbling on the uneven ground. The darkness seemed to close in around me, thickening, swallowing the light. The whispers grew louder, mocking me, urging me forward. It wasn't just the forest anymore. It was something else, something that knew me. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I pushed through the underbrush, my body screaming in protest, but I didn't care. There was only one thought in my mind. Get out. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I pushed, the path never seemed to end. The trees stretched on endlessly, the whispers growing louder and louder. And then I heard it, a loud snap of a twig, followed by a low growl. I spun around, my breath ragged. But this time, I didn't see anything. Just shadows. Moving. Watching. "You can't escape," the voice growled, louder now, with an almost malicious edge. I wanted to scream, but the words died in my throat. I couldn't even move. My body was frozen, caught in the grip of the darkness that surrounded me. Was this the end? Or had it only just begun? My body trembled, but I couldn't move. The growl still lingered in the air, vibrating through my chest. It was closer now, too close. The shadows were no longer just figments of my imagination. They were shapes, darker than the night itself, creeping toward me with unnatural fluidity. I tried to speak, to shout, to call for help, but nothing came. My throat felt tight, as though the very air had turned to concrete, suffocating me from the inside. My feet finally found movement instinctively. I didn't know how I managed to take that first step, but I did. The moment I moved, the growl intensified, a low, guttural sound that rattled the very ground beneath me. The shadows flickered and shifted, becoming more defined with every passing second. They were more than just the absence of light, they were something else. Something old. Ancient. I ran, my legs burning with each stride, but it felt as though the forest was pushing back, trying to keep me trapped in its endless, dark labyrinth. The path seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense, as if it were reshaping itself with every step I took. I couldn't tell if I was getting closer to an exit or deeper into the heart of whatever nightmare this place was. The forest was alive, and it was toying with me. Suddenly, a figure appeared ahead of me, half-formed in the dim light. At first, I thought it was another shadow, but no, it was a person. Or at least, it looked like a person. It was a man, or something that resembled one. His clothes were torn, his face hidden by the tangle of matted hair. But what struck me the most was the way he stood, completely still, as though he had been there for eternity, waiting. Waiting for what? For me? Or for someone else? I froze, unsure of what to do. I had heard stories about people who wandered too far into the wilderness, only to be consumed by the land itself. Was this man one of them? Or was he something worse? I should have turned back. I should have run. But I didn't. "Help me," he rasped, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in years. The words hung in the air, like a curse, a warning. I took a step toward him, but the instant I did, he snapped his head around to face me. His eyes, they were empty. Hollow. No light. No life. Just black, empty sockets staring right through me, as if he could see into the very depths of my soul. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The ground beneath me seemed to buckle, as if the earth itself was shifting. The shadows moved closer, curling around me, tightening. The whispering began again, louder this time, as if the very air was filled with voices. They were laughing. No, they were chanting, calling my name, pulling me toward the figure. "Why are you here?" the man croaked, his mouth opening wider than should have been possible. "You shouldn't have come. You don't belong here." I tried to scream, but the sound died in my chest. My body felt paralyzed, like the forest had sunk its roots deep into my veins, holding me in place. The figure stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. As he got closer, I could see that his skin, if you could even call it that, was stretched taut, as if his body had been pulled from all directions at once. It wasn't human. Not anymore. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished into the shadows, swallowed whole by the darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe around me. I was left standing alone, trembling, lost in the void of the forest. But something had changed. The air had thickened, pressing against my chest, suffocating me. The whispers were gone, replaced by a steady, rhythmic thumping, a heartbeat. But it wasn't mine. It was coming from somewhere deep within the forest, too deep, too far to escape. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move forward. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop now. The shadows were still following me, creeping along the edges of my vision, waiting for me to make one wrong move. As I walked, the forest seemed to shift again, the trees growing closer together, their gnarled branches reaching out to claw at my skin. I felt the eyes on me again, the presence that had been watching me since I first set foot in this place. Only now, it wasn't just the forest. It was something else. Something older. Something that had been here long before I ever existed. The whispers returned, growing louder, more urgent. I could hear them clearly now, each word sharp and distinct. "You're getting closer," they hissed. "Closer to the heart. But will you be able to find your way out?" My pulse quickened. The forest was speaking to me. But what was it saying? I couldn't understand. I didn't want to understand. The heartbeat grew louder, thumping in my ears, shaking the very ground beneath me. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape it. The darkness was closing in. And that was when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the path. Another person. Or was it? It was too far to make out, but it was tall, unnaturally tall. It stood motionless, bathed in the faint light that seemed to glow from nowhere, like it was waiting for me. I didn't move. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something shift, something unnatural. A shadow too dark to be cast by the trees, a shape that was moving toward me, gliding through the air, its presence suffocating the space around me. "Run," the voice whispered urgently. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught in the web of the forest's gaze. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to face whatever was coming. But it was already too late. The figure ahead, tall, impossibly tall, did not move, yet there was something about it that pulled my eyes toward it, as if I couldn't look away. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to turn and sprint in the opposite direction. But my legs wouldn't cooperate. They were frozen, heavy as stone, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I stood there, transfixed by the looming shadow ahead. The heartbeat echoed in the distance, closer now, more frantic. It was as if the very pulse of the forest had become my own, sinking with the dread that filled every inch of my body. My hands trembled, the fingers twitching in an attempt to grab onto something, anything, before I was swallowed by the growing darkness. I tried to scream again, but my voice was lost, smothered by the thick, unnatural silence that hung around me. The whispering in the air became sharper, more insistent, like a chorus of voices layered on top of each other. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." I wanted to close my eyes. I wanted to block out the sight of the thing that stood ahead, but I couldn't. It was as if it was etched into my vision, burned into my mind. Then, the figure moved. It wasn't a shift of the body, not like a person walking. It was more like a sudden, fluid motion, a ripple in space itself, as though the air had been around it. The thing glided forward with an inhuman grace, its long limbs extending unnaturally, its presence filling the space between us like a heavy, suffocating fog. My breath hitched, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin as I took a small step backward. The ground underfoot seemed to hum with energy, the dirt shifting slightly as though the earth itself was breathing, alive and aware of my presence. It stopped just a few feet in front of me, its gaze, if you could call it that, locked onto me. The shadow of its face seemed to ripple and shift, as though it couldn't quite decide what form it wanted to take. It wasn't human. No. It wasn't anything that belonged in this world. And then, it spoke. The voice that came from it wasn't a voice at all. It was a sensation, a sharp, jarring presence in my mind, like a scream that echoed through my very thoughts. "Why do you keep running?" it asked, its words laced with an almost mocking tone. "You're already here. It's too late to run." The air around me grew colder, the shadows deepening. The trees groaned as though they were straining under some unseen weight, and the ground seemed to pulse in time with the rhythmic thumping that still echoed in my ears. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat. I was trapped, suspended in some twisted limbo where time felt like it was slipping away, running faster than I could comprehend. "Who are you?" I finally managed to force out, my voice barely above a whisper. My words seemed hollow, lost in the void between us. The figure tilted its head, a strange, inhuman gesture. For a moment, I thought I saw something akin to a smile stretch across its face, if that's what it could be called. It wasn't a smile that reassured. No, this was something far darker. Something that made my blood run cold. "I am the thing that walks behind you," it replied, its voice sliding across my skin like ice. "The shadow that never leaves. The echo of all the things you've buried in your soul." My heart hammered in my chest, but my feet refused to move. Every part of me wanted to run, to escape, but the weight of the creature's presence held me in place. It wasn't just its physical form that terrified me, it was the knowing in its words, the way it spoke of my own inner fears like they were its own. "You don't even know how long I've been with you," it murmured, its voice like a distant murmur, as though it were speaking to itself. "How long I've followed you. Watching. Waiting." A cold, sickening realization began to spread through me. This thing, it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some random force of nature. It had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface of my mind, buried under the weight of my memories and traumas. "You think you're alone in this place," it continued, its form growing more distorted, more fluid, as if the shadows around it were bending to its will. "But you're not. You're never alone." I shook my head violently, trying to deny the truth of its words, but the more I fought, the clearer it became. The dark figure wasn't just some external threat. It was a manifestation of everything I had ever feared, every loss, every mistake, every regret. The things I had buried deep inside myself, refusing to face them, refusing to acknowledge their existence. And now they were here, taking form, standing in front of me. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening as panic surged within me. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dim light, twin pools of darkness that seemed to reach out, dragging me into them. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "You have already crossed the threshold. Now, you must face what lies within." A sudden, intense pressure built in my skull. The world around me spun, the trees blurring together, the ground buckling beneath me. I felt as though I was falling, tumbling into the abyss of my own mind. And then, a snap. A crack of thunder. The world went dark. The darkness was absolute. No light. No sound. Only a profound silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. My body felt numb, frozen in place as if the world around me had ceased to exist. My mind screamed, but there was nothing to anchor me, nothing to hold on to. I wasn't sure if I was still standing or if I had collapsed onto the ground. I reached out, hands trembling, but there was nothing. Nowhere, no space. Just an infinite void stretching endlessly in every direction. The feeling was suffocating. My chest felt tight, my lungs struggling to draw in even the smallest breath. Then, a whisper. The same voice, that cold, mocking voice from before. It echoed in the darkness, sharp and insistent. "Do you feel it now?" I shuddered, but the words weren't just spoken. They were inside me, reverberating in my mind. Each syllable was a heavy pulse, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. "The walls are closing in, the shadows are growing longer. I could hear the faintest rustling, like a breath being drawn from somewhere deep within the abyss. It was so quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was there, surrounding me. The air tasted metallic, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. You think you can escape this place? The whisper turned into a growl, low and vibrating, like it was coming from all directions. It was all around me, inside me, and it made my head throb, like my skull was being crushed under some immense pressure. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms, trying to ground myself, but it was no use. The suffocating void was all I could feel. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the echo of that cold, knowing voice circled like a predator around its prey. Suddenly, a flash of light, sharp and blinding, pierced through the thick shadow. I gasped, my eyes squinting against the brightness, but the light did not warm me. It felt wrong. It was harsh, unnatural, like the glare of an oncoming storm. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. I was back in the forest. The sudden change left me disoriented. The thick, oppressive darkness had lifted, but the air still felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. My heart raced, a frantic drumbeat in my chest, and my breath came out in shallow gasps. My surroundings seemed different, twisted somehow, like the trees were taller, their branches reaching in strange angles, the ground uneven and shifting beneath my feet. I was no longer alone. The figure that had haunted me in the shadows before was now standing at the edge of my vision, not in front of me, but just out of reach, like a reflection in the corner of my eye. When I turned to face it, it was gone, but I could feel it. I could feel it watching, waiting. You can run, the voice came again, but this time it was in my mind, clearer, more direct. But you can never escape. I stumbled forward, panic surging through me, but my body moved like I was wading through water, slow, unnatural. The world around me began to distort again, the trees warping into twisted shapes, their bark contorting like faces that cried out silently. The ground beneath my feet cracked open, revealing deep shadows beneath the surface, as though the earth itself was swallowing me. I could feel the temperature drop. My breath fogged in front of me, and I began to shiver uncontrollably, my teeth chattering in the cold. I tried to move faster, to get away, but the shadows closed in tighter, twisting the landscape into a nightmare. Every step I took only seemed to bring me deeper into the unknown. Do you remember it now? The voice was louder this time, almost a growl. You thought you buried it, but you never did. Memories, fragments, jagged pieces flashed before my eyes. Faces I hadn't seen in years. Sounds that hadn't echoed in my ears since childhood. A family that no longer existed, a home that had burned down long ago. It was all there, in my mind, swirling together, impossible to escape. I've always been with you. The voice was more insistent now, pressing in from every direction. You can't outrun the past. You can't outrun yourself. I closed my eyes, gripping my head with both hands, willing it to stop. The pressure, the crushing weight of the darkness around me, was too much. My body trembled, my legs weak beneath me. I could barely stand. I was suffocating under the weight of my own fear, my own guilt. But when I opened my eyes again, everything was still there, the figure, the shadows, the memories. And they were closing in. You will never leave, it whispered one last time, its voice a cold, final sentence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But I couldn't. There was nothing I could do. The darkness had already swallowed me whole, and I was lost within it, trapped forever in the maze of my own mind. The whispers, they never stopped. They slid through the air like cold fingers brushing against my skin, crawling into my thoughts, burrowing deep inside. I could hear them in every shadow, feel them in the cracks of my mind. They were with me now, and there was no escape. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, the thick fog of terror around me pressing down like a vice. The air was thick, every breath felt as if I were inhaling a heavy, damp blanket that weighed me down. I could hear the distant rustling of leaves, the creak of branches above me as if someone was shifting between them. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but all that came was the pounding of my heart and the voice that echoed in my skull. You cannot hide from what you are. It wasn't a warning, it was a truth. A truth I didn't want to face. I tried to shake the thoughts away, to block out the whispers, but the more I fought, the louder they became. My hands trembled as I gripped the nearest tree, the bark digging into my palms. My eyes darted around the forest, but all I saw were the same twisted shadows, the same dark silhouettes that threatened to devour me whole. The world had shifted. It was no longer familiar, no longer safe. It was a place of endless horrors, a place where the past and present collided, where there was no division between the two. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged, but each step only seemed to lead me further into the labyrinth. The path had changed again. The trees now loomed over me like giants, their branches intertwining, blocking out the dim light of the moon. I was disoriented, dizzy with fear. I had to move. I had to get out. But no matter how fast I ran, the forest closed in around me, narrowing until there was nothing but darkness and that oppressive weight pressing against me. You can run, the voice came again, cold and mocking, but you cannot escape. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, twisting, bending, and pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The air thickened with every step, growing colder, more suffocating. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, eager to swallow me whole. Every time I looked behind me, I could see something in the distance, shapes, flickering forms in the darkness. But they weren't real. Not in the way I understood reality. They were something else. Something from the depths of my mind. I ran faster, my legs aching, my mind a haze of panic and confusion. The ground beneath me was uneven, full of roots and rocks that threatened to trip me, but I kept moving. I had to keep moving. I could hear something now, following me, closer, always closer. It was the sound of footsteps, not my own, not something natural. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, like someone was tracking me, playing with me. I glanced over my shoulder. For a split second, I saw it. The figure. It was just a shadow at first, a shape that didn't belong, standing at the edge of my vision. But then it moved. No, shifted. The way it moved wasn't right. It was wrong. It didn't follow the rules of space or time. It was like a nightmare, stretching out of the darkness, its limbs contorting in unnatural angles, its face hidden in the shadows. I see you, the voice whispered, and my blood ran cold. I froze. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure stepped closer, its movements erratic, too fast, too unnatural. I could feel its presence, an overwhelming pressure, like it was wrapping around me, drowning me in the dark. Suddenly, the world tilted. The ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, nearly falling. I reached out for something, anything, but my fingers grasped nothing. I was falling into the void again. The darkness swallowed me whole, and everything went silent. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't quiet. It was suffocating. The absence of sound, the absence of life, it was like I was in a place beyond existence. A place where nothing lived, where nothing moved. Then, there it was again. I told you. The voice was closer now, and I could feel it, vibrating through my bones, rattling every fiber of my being. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a presence, a weight that pressed against me, forcing me into submission. You cannot outrun your darkness. You are its prisoner. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my limbs frozen in place. I could feel the weight of my past, every mistake, every regret, every pain, crushing down on me. It was suffocating. It was overwhelming. There was no escape. I thought of the light. I had to find the light. I had to. The ground shifted again, and I was thrown forward. I landed hard, my body hitting the cold earth with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything was still. My pulse hammered in my ears. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. And then, from the shadows, a hand reached out. It was pale, thin, its fingers long and unnaturally graceful, curling toward me like they had been waiting for this moment. I could feel it, the pressure, the inevitability. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a figment of my mind. It was real. It was coming for me. I reached for it, and everything went black. Have you ever wondered how close you were to losing everything? It wasn't the first time I thought about it, but for some reason, tonight, the question felt different. It felt heavier, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I stood there, in the middle of the living room, staring at the window. The city outside was quiet, too quiet, almost like the world had taken a breath and was holding it. I had always been the type to stay to myself. I liked the peace, the familiarity of being alone in my thoughts. But tonight, something felt off. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally long, and the silence was thick, pressing on me, making everything feel suffocating. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. I walked over to the window, pulling the curtains aside. The streetlights cast faint glows over the asphalt, but the shadows between the buildings were deep. Too deep. I frowned, stepping closer. The air felt colder now, and I could see my breath fogging up the glass. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a sigh. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. I shook my head. I was alone, of course. But the sound persisted. It wasn't just a sigh now, it was something else. Something wrong. A whisper that felt like it was coming from the walls themselves, creeping into my ears. You've been running from it for so long. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it real? Had I heard that? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I stepped away from the window, my hands shaking. I glanced around the room again, my eyes darting over every corner, every shadow. But there was nothing. No one. Just the silent, oppressive weight of the dark. My mind raced. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just the stress, just the isolation. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that something wasn't right. I had been living with this feeling for years, ever since that day. That one moment that changed everything. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to steady my breathing. It's not real, I whispered to myself. It's just the quiet. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The whispers were real. The shadows were real. And whatever had been following me for so long was finally getting closer. I turned towards the door, but then the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching, twisting in ways they shouldn't. I stepped back, my heart hammering as I reached for the light switch. But the lights flickered once, then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and I was left standing there, alone with the weight of my own fear. Then the whisper came again, clearer this time, like it was right beside me. You can't escape it. I spun around, my eyes wide, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Nothing but the suffocating silence and the chill in the air. The kind of chill that wasn't from the cold, but from something deeper. Something that made your bones ache. I took a step back, but my foot caught on the edge of the couch, and I stumbled. My hand shot out to steady myself, but as I did, something caught my eye, a movement in the darkness. A figure. It was there, at the edge of the room. At first, it was just a blur, a shadow shifting in the corner of my vision. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see it more clearly. It was a person, tall, thin, impossibly still. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to speak, to call out, but no sound came. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, which hadn't moved a muscle. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. You've been running from me for too long. The voice was louder now, piercing through the silence, and I could feel it inside my head, echoing with every word. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unmovable. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, inch by inch. The figure started moving then, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach, the air becoming thick, almost unbearable. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the figure as it moved closer, its movements jerky, unnatural. And then, with a sudden, terrible clarity, I understood. It was me. The figure was me. I staggered backward, my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. The darkness seemed to swell around me, drowning me in its weight. I had been running from myself, from the truth of what I had done, and now, finally, it was here. I turned and bolted for the door, my hands fumbling for the handle. The sound of my footsteps was deafening in the silence, but behind me, the figure's voice was growing louder. Closer. There's nowhere left to run. With a final, desperate push, I flung open the door and stepped into the hallway. The light was dim, the air stale, but it didn't matter. I just had to get out, away from that thing, away from myself. But the whispers followed. Always. I didn't know what was real anymore. I didn't stop running. My feet hit the cold, hardwood floor with frantic thuds as I stumbled through the dark hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch farther with every step, almost as if they were reaching out, trying to pull me back into that suffocating darkness. My chest tightened with every breath, my heart thudding in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me, trailing me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I reached the staircase and nearly tripped over the first step. I caught myself just in time, my hand gripping the railing for support. But my fingers felt numb, my body trembling with fear. I wanted to look back, but I couldn't. If I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to stop myself from falling deeper into whatever nightmare had started. You can't outrun it. The voice echoed through the house, a whisper that somehow felt louder than everything else. I froze mid-step, my eyes wide. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The sound was real, sharp, and close. I had to get out of here. I had to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The house, my house, felt wrong. The familiar, comforting walls had become alien, cold, and oppressive. I had lived here for years, but now every corner, every creak of the floorboards felt like a trap. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me, the memories, the guilt, everything I had tried to bury, now rising to the surface. I reached the front door, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the handle. It wouldn't turn. The door, the very thing that had always been my escape, was locked. I cursed under my breath, yanking at the handle, but it was useless. It wouldn't budge. I looked around desperately, my eyes darting to the windows, but they were just as useless. The shadows outside seemed to be closing in too, making everything feel like a maze with no way out. You can't leave. You can't hide. The voice was louder now, a cold, mocking tone that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was like it was coming from all around me, echoing through the walls, vibrating in my bones. I turned sharply, my heart pounding in my throat. And then I saw it. The figure. It was there, standing in the hallway just beyond the stairs. It was no longer just a blur of darkness, it was solid, its shape unmistakable. It was tall, thin, like a silhouette carved out of the very shadows themselves. Its face was nothing but a void, a black hole where features should have been. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, pressing in on me like a weight too heavy to carry. You can't outrun the truth. The words came again, and with them, I felt a cold wave of realization crash over me. This wasn't just some nightmare. This wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real. This thing that mirrored me, was a part of me. My darkest self. My past, my guilt, everything I had tried to bury, now had a face, a shape, and it was coming for me. I stumbled back, panic gripping my chest. I had to get away. I had to escape this thing, this truth. I turned and ran down the hallway, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every step. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of something I couldn't escape. I rounded the corner to the kitchen and froze. There, on the floor, was the broken glass from earlier. The one I had knocked over in my panic. It lay in pieces, shards of it scattered across the floor like tiny fragments of my sanity. But it wasn't just the glass that made me stop. It was the shape. The shadows cast by the shards seemed wrong. They seemed to move, twisting, forming shapes that made my skin crawl. I took a step forward, my breath caught in my throat. The shadows shifted, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, someone, in the reflection of the glass. But it was gone in an instant, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The figure was closer now. I could feel it. I could feel its presence behind me, just out of sight, yet so close I could hear its breath, shallow and cold. You can't run forever. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the empty kitchen. But I felt it, it was there. watching me, waiting. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stand still, couldn't let it catch me. My legs were trembling, my body shaking from the strain, but I pushed myself forward, down the hallway, toward the back door. I reached it, my hand fumbling for the handle. But this time, it opened. The door swung outward with a soft creak, and I stumbled outside, gasping for air. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, cold and biting. The street was eerily silent, the only sound being the distant hum of the city. But it was different now. The quiet was oppressive. It was as though everything around me was holding its breath. I didn't know what I was running from anymore. The house, the shadows, the figure, was it real? Or was it all just in my head? I turned, my eyes scanning the darkened street, looking for some sign of movement, some clue that what I was seeing was real. But there was nothing. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. And then, in the distance, I thought I saw something, a figure standing at the end of the block. It was too far to make out clearly, but the way it stood there, motionless, reminded me of the figure inside the house. It was watching me, waiting. "You can't escape me." The voice came again, louder now, like it was right next to me, breathing down my neck. I turned and started running again, faster now, my legs burning with the effort. The fear surged through me, making every step feel heavier. But no matter how fast I ran, I knew deep down I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't outrun myself. My legs burned as I sprinted through the empty street, my breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. The cold night air bit at my skin, but it wasn't enough to numb the terror clawing at my chest. I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. I didn't know how long I'd been running, minutes, hours. Time had become a blur, all sense of it swallowed by the growing weight of the fear that pressed down on me like a suffocating fog. The figure was still there, just beyond my vision, always a shadow in my peripheral, always just out of reach. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, and with every step I took, the silence grew more oppressive. The streetlights flickered above, casting jagged shadows on the pavement. Their glow seemed to distort, stretching and warping in the periphery of my vision, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. The sound of my footfalls echoed in the emptiness, but I could hear something else now, faint whispers, voices, distant and indistinct. "You can't outrun what's inside you." I shuddered at the voice, the words like ice sinking into my bones. My pace faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. In that moment of hesitation, the air around me grew colder, thick with the presence of something, someone. It was there. I spun around, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my throat. But there was nothing behind me. Just the road. Just the shadows. I took another step, this time more cautiously, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. The street was as silent as before, too still, too empty. But I could feel it. I could feel the weight of it pressing on my chest, like invisible hands were gripping me tighter with every passing second. I kept walking, forcing myself to move, to keep going, even though my body screamed at me to stop. My mind was in chaos, a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and doubt. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? The more I tried to grasp onto reality, the more it slipped through my fingers. Then, ahead of me, I saw something, a flicker in the darkness. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but no. It was there, just up ahead, near the alleyway between two buildings. A figure. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. It wasn't just any figure, it was him. The same figure from the house. The one I had seen standing in the hallway, the one I had felt breathing down my neck. He was standing in the shadows, motionless, staring at me with that same absence of a face. That void where a face should have been. The empty blackness. You can't escape the truth. The voice was louder now, closer, reverberating through my very core. I took a step back, my heart racing, and that's when I heard it. A faint creak, a shifting sound, coming from behind me. I spun around, my head jerking toward the noise. Nothing. Just the darkened street. Just the silence. But then I felt it. The unmistakable presence of something watching me. From every direction. Surrounding me. The figure in front of me moved, just slightly. Its head tilted, like it was studying me, observing my every twitch, my every breath. And then it began to step forward. I didn't know what it wanted, but I was certain it wasn't anything good. I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't just a shadow. It was the manifestation of something darker, something deep inside of me, something I had buried for far too long. I turned again, my feet stumbling on the pavement as I tried to find some escape. But the alley was narrow, a dead end. There was nowhere to go. No escape. And then it spoke again. The voice, so cold, so sure of itself. You can't hide from what you've done. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. They resonated deep within me, stirring memories I had long ago buried beneath layers of denial. My throat tightened, my breath caught in my chest. I had tried so hard to move past it, to forget. But I couldn't. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface, a shadow that had followed me through every moment of my life. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the sound, the presence, the unbearable weight of it all. But the darkness felt thicker now. It was suffocating. I could feel it closing in on me, creeping up my spine, tightening its grip on my chest. I opened my eyes again, and for a moment, the figure was gone. The alley was empty, silent. But the fear was still there. It hadn't left. I was still trapped. In my mind, in my memories, in the suffocating grip of something I couldn't escape. It's not real, I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself. This isn't real. But I could feel the presence growing stronger, the weight of my own guilt pressing on me, suffocating me. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no escaping it. No matter how far I ran, no matter how fast, I could never outrun myself. The figure was back, just behind me now. I didn't need to look. I knew it was there. I could feel it again, its presence. The air grew thicker, suffocating, like the darkness was pressing in from every angle. My heart beat so loudly in my chest that I was certain it could be heard across the entire city. Each beat seemed to echo in the emptiness of the alley, making the silence even more unbearable. I turned slowly, my body frozen in place, my feet unwilling to move. There, just behind me, was the figure. But now, it was closer. Its face, if it could be called that, was a swirling void, a black pit that seemed to consume all light around it. I couldn't look at it directly. It was as if my eyes were repelled, like they couldn't handle its sheer absence. It didn't move, not yet. But it was there, just behind my shoulder, the very air shifting around it as though it was bending the world itself to its will. You can't escape, the voice spoke again, but this time it didn't come from the figure. It came from everywhere. The shadows stretched, reaching toward me like fingers, pulling at the very core of my being. I staggered back, my body finally responding, stumbling over my own legs, desperate to put distance between myself and the thing that haunted me. But no matter where I moved, the figure remained in my peripheral, lurking just outside my view. It was like trying to outrun your own shadow, knowing it would always catch up. I backed into the brick wall of the alley, my breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The wall was cold and rough against my palms, but it didn't offer any comfort. It only felt like a prison, trapping me in this nightmare. I pressed my hands to my eyes, hoping that if I just shut everything out, the presence would disappear. But the darkness remained. You can't run from yourself. The voice, it wasn't just an accusation anymore. It was a condemnation. It was a truth I couldn't deny. I had done things I thought I could bury, things I thought I could forget. But they had always been there, just beneath the surface. Waiting. Watching. I could hear my pulse in my ears, the beating of my heart drowning out everything else. I felt as though I might collapse, my body unable to bear the weight of the terror, the overwhelming feeling that something was closing in, pulling at my very soul. And then, as if in response to my panic, the figure moved. I didn't see it coming, not until it was right in front of me. The moment it shifted, time seemed to stretch, slowing down as it closed the distance between us. I gasped, unable to breathe, unable to think. There was only the figure, and the voice, and the crushing realization that whatever this was, it was a part of me. Its movements were wrong, unnatural. The limbs, if they could be called that, were too long, too thin, like they didn't belong to any human body. They swayed unnaturally, as if they were not entirely connected to the figure's torso. The shadows around it seemed to distort, swirling in ways that defied logic. "Look at me." The voice echoed in my mind, inside my skull, vibrating with a terrible weight. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see it. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was paralyzed, locked in place by an overwhelming force that gripped my very soul. I looked into the figure's face, or what should have been its face, and the void seemed to swallow me whole. There were no eyes, no features. Just an endless blackness that pulled at my thoughts, at my memories. I could feel it scraping at the deepest parts of my mind, exposing my darkest secrets, my most hidden fears. In that moment, I understood. This thing, this creature, was not just some external horror. It was me. It was everything I had tried to hide, every mistake, every regret, every flaw. It was my darkness, manifest. "You can't escape me," it whispered again, and for the first time, I heard a hint of satisfaction in the voice. It knew. It knew exactly what I was running from. I collapsed to my knees, overwhelmed. The ground felt as though it was shifting beneath me. My chest tightened, my breath came in shallow gasps, and the weight of my guilt pressed down on me like 1,000 pounds. I wanted to scream, to beg for it to stop, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think clearly. I was drowning in it, in the figure, in the fear, in the knowledge that I couldn't hide anymore. "It's too late," the figure said, its voice cold and final. "You can never outrun yourself. Not this time." It reached toward me, its long, twisted fingers brushing against my face. The touch was cold, almost ice-like, but it sent a jolt of energy through my body, a sharp sting of something deeper. Pain. The pain of confronting what I had hidden. The pain of facing the truth. I closed my eyes, unable to bear the intensity of it all. And in that moment, I heard it, the sound of something breaking, a sharp crack that echoed through the alley. It was like the very fabric of reality was fracturing, splintering apart. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw that the alley was no longer the alley. The walls stretched impossibly high, the shadows twisting into shapes that danced and reached toward me. The world was collapsing, warping into something that made no sense. "It's too late," the figure whispered again, its voice now like a distant chant, fading into the chaos. And then, for the first time, I heard another voice. A voice that was mine, but not mine. "It's never too late." The world around me trembled, and I realized, in that instant, that the choice wasn't whether I could escape the figure. The choice was whether I could escape myself. The world around me cracked. The sky tore open in jagged lines, revealing nothing but blackness, an abyss that swallowed all light, all hope. I could hear the distant echo of 1,000 voices, whispering, murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. They weren't just voices, they were thoughts, fears, regrets, and desires. All of them intertwined, all of them mine. I was no longer in the alley. I was no longer anywhere familiar. Everything had distorted, become a nightmare made flesh. The concrete had turned to ash beneath my feet, crumbling away with each step I took. The shadows that had once been mere silhouettes now loomed like towering giants, twisting into shapes too grotesque to comprehend. The figure, the creature, was gone, but I could still feel its presence, like a stain on the air, a suffocating reminder of what I had been running from. "It's never too late." The voice was mine, but it felt foreign, like a whisper from some distant part of my soul that I had ignored for too long. It was like a call to arms, a challenge that came not from the figure but from the deepest corners of myself. I staggered forward, the weight of the world pressing down on me. My legs felt heavy, as though the very ground beneath me was resisting my movement. Each breath came in short, sharp gasps, and the air was thick with a metallic taste that clung to the back of my throat. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Each step I took seemed to pull the world back into focus, like the pieces of a shattered mirror coming together. The edges of the distorted world began to blur, the impossible shapes starting to take form. I was walking through memories, my memories. The streets, the buildings, the familiar places I had once known, all of it was coming back. But they were twisted now, distorted versions of the reality I had left behind. A park, once vibrant and full of life, stood before me. But now, the trees were barren, their branches stretching like skeletal hands, reaching toward me with sharp, jagged fingers. The swings creaked in the wind, moving back and forth in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. The laughter of children, once a soothing sound, now felt like a mocking echo, a distant memory of a time that had long since passed. I could feel something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my every instinct screaming for me to turn around, to run, to escape. But I didn't. I couldn't. It's not real. This isn't real. I repeated the mantra in my head like a prayer, but the words felt hollow. They were empty, like they didn't belong to me anymore. As I passed through the park, a sudden movement caught my eye. A figure, just beyond the swing set, standing motionless in the shadows. The silhouette of a child, their small form hunched over, as though they were waiting for me to approach. I stopped dead in my tracks. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing to my ears. "Don't." The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A whisper from the depths of my own mind. I knew what it was trying to warn me about, but I couldn't stop myself. I was already moving, drawn to it like a moth to the flame. I stepped closer. The figure remained still, its back to me, the hair of its head hanging limp and tangled. My breath hitched in my throat as I took another step, closer now, until I could see the child's face. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The face was pale, hollow-eyed, staring out into the distance with an expression of utter emptiness. It was as if the child had seen something so terrible that it had hollowed out their very soul. I reached out a trembling hand, the air thick with dread. My fingers hovered just above its shoulder, but before I could make contact, the figure turned. Its eyes locked onto mine, black, endless, blades that swallowed every bit of light in their path. "You're not ready," the child whispered. "You're still running." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I staggered back, my heart racing, my chest tightening as if the air itself had thickened and become unbearable. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world spun around me, the shadows closing in, the whispers growing louder. "You're not ready." The child's figure faded, dissolving into the air like smoke, and the park dissolved with it. The twisted trees, the broken swings, the silent echoes of forgotten laughter, all of it vanished, leaving only a vast emptiness. The darkness crept in again, silent and suffocating, but this time it was different. This time I felt calm. It wasn't fear that gripped me anymore. It was acceptance. I had been running from it for so long, from the truth, from my past, from the darkness inside me. But now I understood. The figure wasn't something that could be defeated. It wasn't some monster that could be killed. It was me. "You can't outrun it," I whispered to myself, the weight of the words finally settling in. The figure, the fear, the guilt, it was all a part of me. And now, for the first time, I wasn't running. I stood still, alone in the vast void, and I let it come. What if everything you thought was real was never real at all? The question echoed in my mind, drifting in and out like a fleeting thought, just beyond my grasp. But it wasn't a thought, it was a feeling. A feeling that seemed to stretch the boundaries of what I knew until I wasn't sure where I ended and the world began. I woke up in my apartment, as I always did. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustling of the blinds against the window as the morning light filtered in, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air, all of it was normal. But something felt off. There was a heaviness to the air, a subtle unease that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a loud sensation, no jarring noise or sudden shift, just a quiet shift, as though the world had tilted just slightly to the side. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. The clock on the wall read 7:30, but my body felt as though I had been asleep for days. I stretched, feeling the tightness in my muscles, and then froze. A soft sound, something like the faintest scratch, came from the corner of the room. I didn't turn immediately. The sound could have been anything, a mouse, the wind, a pipe shifting. But it was there, persistent, like a whisper, pulling at the edge of my awareness. I forced myself to stand, the floor creaking underfoot as if the building itself was sighing with the weight of years. I walked over to the corner, my heart beating faster now. I hated this feeling, this not knowing. The closer I got, the clearer the sound became, a gentle tap, 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 almost rhythmic, but faint, like someone lightly tapping a finger against the wall. I peered into the shadowed corner, half expecting to see nothing. But there it was, an old chair, the one I'd inherited from my grandmother. It was slightly rocking, just a bit, as if someone had recently stood up from it. But I was alone. I swallowed hard. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just tired, I thought, stepping back from the chair and moving to the kitchen to distract myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling. There was something off about this place, about today. Something small, something imperceptible, but growing steadily. I tried to focus. The kettle whistled, steam rising in curling swirls. I reached for a cup, but then stopped, my hand hovering above the counter. The smell, faint but distinct, was in the air now. A strange, sharp scent. Like something burning. No, not burning, like a chemical, something almost metallic. I turned quickly, scanning the room. Nothing. Just the soft, regular hum of the refrigerator. Just the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. It's nothing, I told myself again. But the sense of wrongness didn't fade. It lingered, like a shadow behind my every thought. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing in the hallway. It wasn't clear at first, just a vague shape, a silhouette, like something trying to blend into the shadows. I blinked. It was gone. Just like that. Did I imagine that? I walked over to the hallway, heart racing again. The light was dim in the corridor, the apartment's hallway never fully illuminated by the weak sunlight coming through the window. I stepped into the space, feeling the sudden weight of the air pressing against my skin, making every breath harder to take. There was no figure. No shadow. Nothing. Just empty space. But I could feel it. The weight of something unseen, something there, but just beyond my reach. I turned back to the kitchen, shaking my head. I was being ridiculous. It was just the tiredness, just the stress of everything that had happened. The job I hated, the friends I'd lost touch with, the relationships that had slowly, quietly unraveled over the past year. I tried to focus on something normal, something solid. The cup. The coffee. But even the smell seemed wrong now, like it was growing fainter with each passing second. The world outside my window was still, unchanging. People walked along the streets, cars honked, the usual hum of the city sounded distant but familiar. Yet, inside, the sense of dread was suffocating. I tried to shake it off. I'm just tired. Maybe a walk will help. I grabbed my coat, stepping out into the cool morning air. The walk to the park was short, the streets empty and quiet for once, as if everyone had decided to stay indoors. My footsteps echoed louder than they should, each one punctuated by a strange, metallic ring that seemed to come from the street itself. I paused for a moment. The silence felt oppressive now, like the world around me had gone too quiet. Not a single car passed by. The wind had died down. Not even a bird called out from the trees. Then I heard it. A soft shuffle. A footstep just behind me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the feeling returned, the one I had felt earlier. The sensation of being watched. Of being followed. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The street was empty. I could feel my heart racing now. My breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. It's nothing, just a passerby, I tried to convince myself. But the unease lingered. I kept walking, faster now, each footstep seeming louder in the silence. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight. Something was waiting. And then, the world shifted. I blinked, and suddenly, the street looked different. The buildings were taller, the sky darker, the air colder. The people who had been walking earlier were now gone, replaced by shadows that didn't quite look human. They moved without purpose, aimlessly, like ghosts drifting in and out of existence. I stopped. This wasn't right. This couldn't be real. But it felt too real. The sounds, the smells, the overwhelming weight of the air, all of it pressed in on me, as if the fabric of the world had been torn open, revealing something beneath it. I turned to leave, but the street stretched farther than it should have. The end was nowhere in sight. The shadows seemed to reach for me, pulling at the edges of my vision. The footsteps. The shuffle. It was closer now, much closer. I took a step back, then another, and then I heard the voice. "You can't escape me." I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice lingered in my mind, its words repeating over and over, like an echo I couldn't escape. "You can't escape me." My pulse hammered in my chest as I slowly backed away, the street still stretching impossibly long before me. The shadows, once distant, now seemed to move closer, undulating like they were alive. I blinked hard, but nothing changed. The world was shifting around me, warping in ways I couldn't grasp. Every sound was distorted now, the wind, the distant hum of the city, even my own breath felt muffled, like I was underwater. I turned on my heel and started running, my footsteps echoing in the silent, stretched street. The buildings on either side loomed over me, taller than they should have been, their windows dark and empty. It felt like I was running into some kind of trap, but there was nowhere to hide. Nowhere to go. The chill of the air cut through me, biting at my skin. I ran, faster, harder, but with every step, it felt like the distance between me and whatever was following me grew shorter. The shuffle was there again, that quiet, dragging sound. It was no longer in the distance, but right behind me. I'm being followed. I know I am. My thoughts screamed, but my legs refused to move any faster. The shadowy figures on the street corner were no longer just silhouettes. They were moving, stepping closer, their forms becoming more defined. There was something off about them, something grotesque in the way they moved. Like people, but not people. Their faces were twisted, elongated, as if they didn't belong in this world at all. I couldn't stop. My body was running on pure panic now, the only thought in my mind to get away. I whipped around another corner, hoping for an exit, for something familiar to ground me, but instead, I found myself in a place I didn't recognize. The park. But not the park I knew. The trees here were tall and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, stretching over the path in a grotesque canopy. The grass beneath my feet was thick and tangled, like it hadn't been tended to in years. A loud crack echoed from somewhere behind me. I froze, my body rigid. That sound, I knew that sound. It was the unmistakable sound of a footstep. A heavy, dragging footstep. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The park was empty. Just like the street had been. Is this real? I asked myself, my mind struggling to grasp what was happening. The air felt thick, as if the space between moments had stretched into something foreign, something unnatural. The trees, the sky, even the distant buildings, they all seemed to bend under some invisible weight, as if reality itself was buckling. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just in my head. It was in the air, filling the space around me, suffocating me with its presence. You can't escape me. You're mine now. I stumbled back, my hand grasping at a nearby tree to steady myself. The bark was rough under my fingers, but it didn't feel real. It felt like a dream, an illusion, an image my mind was forcing me to see. It's a nightmare, I thought. It has to be. I looked around desperately, as if searching for some sign that everything would snap back to normal. But the more I looked, the more the world seemed to twist. The sky darkened further, the shadows growing deeper, stretching toward me like tendrils. I turned again, running this time without thinking. The footsteps were closer now, and I could feel the weight of them behind me, dragging and scraping against the ground. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let whatever it was catch me. As I ran, I saw a figure ahead. At first, it looked like a person, a real person. But as I got closer, my heart stopped. It wasn't a person at all. It was a reflection, but not my own. The figure in the reflection was twisted, distorted, standing in the center of a darkened mirror that hadn't been there before. The reflection was grinning, a grin that stretched too wide, its eyes empty and dark like a deep abyss. It's not real. None of this is real, I told myself. But my hand shook as I reached for the mirror. The cool surface of the glass felt like ice against my fingertips, sending a shock of cold up my arm. I pulled away quickly. Something was wrong. The reflection stayed there, smiling, watching. The shuffle, the dragging steps. They were closer now. I turned to face whatever was coming, my breath caught in my throat. But there was nothing. Nothing but darkness, slowly spilling over the path, swallowing the light. I took a step back. My foot met something soft, like a hand reaching up from the earth to grab me. I twisted and fell, but the ground was wrong. It wasn't solid. It gave way beneath me like it was made of sand, like it wasn't real. I struggled to push myself up, but the more I moved, the more the world seemed to slip. No, 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 this can't be happening. This can't be real. A soft sound, a whisper, curled around my thoughts. You can't escape. I looked up. The shadows had moved in, completely surrounding me. I was trapped in this twisted world, with no way out, no way to escape. The footsteps stopped, and the air grew still again, too still, like the world had taken a breath and was waiting. A figure emerged from the dark, a silhouette against the swirling shadows. Its shape was indistinct, just a blur of darkness. But I knew it was there, watching. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe. The shadows weren't just surrounding me now, they were inside me. They crawled through my veins, suffocating me from within. I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. The air was thick with something heavy, something dark that pressed against my chest, making it harder and harder to take a full breath. This is real. This is real. This is real. I repeated the mantra in my head like a prayer, as if my thoughts could force the world to snap back into its rightful place. But the more I focused, the more the darkness closed in. The figure in front of me was now just a silhouette, but it wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving, no, slithering, like something too large to be confined by normal human shape. Its form stretched and twisted unnaturally. For a split second, its shape resembled a person, a woman, but her face was distorted, stretched out of all proportion. It looked like someone had taken a face and tried to twist it into a grotesque mask, the eyes too large, too empty, with black voids that stared directly into mine. The mouth was wide, impossibly wide, as though it could swallow me whole. I need to wake up. Please, let me wake up. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed onto the cold, soft earth. The ground didn't feel solid anymore. It was like lying on thick wet sand, sinking deeper with every second that passed. I reached out, trying to grip anything, but the earth slipped through my fingers as though it was made of smoke. What is happening? My mind scrambled for answers, but there was nothing but a vast, echoing silence that mocked my confusion. The creature moved closer. I could feel its presence even before I saw it clearly. It was a feeling, a cold, pressing sensation that filled the air, squeezing the life out of everything around me. My heart raced, thundering in my chest, but no matter how much I fought to push myself up, I couldn't move. The darkness was pulling me in, and the harder I struggled, the further I sank. It whispered now, its voice soft but unmistakable. "You've always been here." I froze. That voice. I knew that voice. It wasn't just the creature speaking, it was my own voice. My own mind was betraying me. No, this can't be real. I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder, and I whipped around, my vision blurred by panic. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of shadows. I was alone, or so it seemed. The voice continued, echoing through the void, a reminder of my own twisted reality. "Everything you see, it's you. This is what you are. This is what you've always been." I shut my eyes tightly, trying to block it out, but the words only grew louder. They pounded in my head like a drumbeat, relentless and deafening. I curled into a ball, desperate to escape the voice, the sight of that horrifying thing that wasn't even a thing but more a presence, the suffocating awareness that something inside of me had woken up. Something that shouldn't have been there. The air around me grew colder. The silence was suffocating. Then, the ground beneath me shifted again. This time, I felt it more distinctly, something hard, jagged, scraping against my skin. I reached down instinctively, my fingers brushing against rough stone. It wasn't soil anymore. The ground felt like a crumbling structure, like I was lying in the ruins of something long abandoned. But the stone, it wasn't just ordinary stone. It had an unnatural warmth to it, like it had been touched by something unseen, something alive. I pushed myself up, my hands shaking as they gripped the stone. My feet scraped against it as I tried to steady myself. I took a step forward, but the stone beneath me felt like it was alive, as though it had its own pulse, its own beat. "Wake up." The words cut through the chaos of my thoughts, and for the briefest moment, a sliver of hope opened up. Wake up. Maybe this was a dream. Maybe I could still break free. I forced myself to focus, to wake up. But my body didn't obey. My arms and legs were heavy, as if the very air was weighing them down, keeping me bound to this nightmare. The whisper came again, a low hiss that seemed to seep through my skull. "You can't. You belong here." It was the same voice again. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping, blending together, rising in volume until it felt like my mind was going to split in two. "No. I don't belong here." The thought pushed through my fear, barely, but it was there. The ground beneath me shifted once more, and I stumbled. This time, I didn't have to look to know. I could feel it. The reflection. The mirror had appeared again. I had forgotten about it. How could I have forgotten? It was there, right in front of me, hanging in midair like it didn't belong, like it was pulled from another reality. I didn't want to look, didn't want to face it, but something made me. My body moved against my will. My head turned. I looked into the mirror, and what I saw was me, but it wasn't. The reflection wasn't me anymore. It was something else. The face staring back at me was twisted in a horrible grin, but it wasn't smiling. The eyes were empty, black like two holes leading into nothing. And it was laughing. A sound, distant at first, but growing louder, a low, guttural laugh that filled the entire void. It was me, yes, but it wasn't. And as I stared at it, I felt myself falling backward, pulled into the glass. My reflection reached for me, its long, bony fingers curling like claws, its face now so close I could feel the heat of its breath on my skin. I tried to pull away, but my feet wouldn't move. My heart pounded, my chest tight with terror and the laughter. It kept growing louder, louder, until it was deafening. I closed my eyes, trying to shut it out, trying to wake up, but when I opened them again, everything had changed. The mirror was gone, and I was no longer on the ground. I was standing in my own bedroom. I blinked. My bedroom. My real bedroom. Or was it? I didn't know anymore. The light from the window fell in crooked lines across the floor, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers, reaching toward me. I stood there, frozen, my body heavy, too tired to move. I could still feel the warmth of the mirror, the laughter echoing in my mind, but everything here felt so wrong. It didn't make sense. I had been lying in the dirt, in the ruins. I had just been there. So how was I back here? The bed was untouched, the sheets neat, as if I had never even slept in it. The air was still, too still, pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. The clock on the nightstand ticked with a sharp, mechanical sound that filled the silence. Tick, tick, tick. A chill ran through me. Was I awake now? Or was this another layer? Another dream I couldn't escape? I turned slowly, my heart pounding, my head swimming with confusion. The walls of the room were too close, too confining. They felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. There was a faint smell in the air. Something metallic, like rust. It made my stomach turn. The scent wasn't right, and it reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. Something alive? I didn't know. It didn't belong here. I walked to the window, my footsteps almost soundless on the carpet, and pulled the curtains aside. Outside, the world was dark, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. The neighborhood looked as it always had, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something lurking just out of view. My gaze darted across the street, my eyes searching the shadows. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, trying to steady my breath. The cold from outside seeped into my skin, but it didn't bring any comfort. It only made the air inside feel thicker, heavier. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker. I turned my head sharply, but there was nothing there. I swallowed hard, fighting the rising panic. I was losing my mind. I had to be. But as I stared back at the window, I saw it again. A shadow. It darted past the edge of the street lamp, too fast for me to catch clearly. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely, but the shape was unmistakable. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, gliding along the edge of the street like it wasn't part of the world at all. My breath caught in my throat. I'm not imagining this. I'm not. I stepped away from the window, backing into the middle of the room, my heart racing. The floor creaked underfoot, but I couldn't bring myself to look down. I didn't want to see something else that shouldn't be there. The smell of rust grew stronger, more suffocating. A noise, soft at first, came from behind me. A scratching sound, like something dragging across the floor. Slow. Methodical. Each scrape seemed to echo, reverberating in the walls, vibrating deep inside my bones. It was coming closer. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Focus. I told myself, trying to steady my breath, trying to calm my racing mind. I could still hear the sound, the dragging motion, getting louder with each passing second. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It had to be a part of the dream, but one I couldn't escape. But then I felt it. A hand. Cold, clammy fingers brushed against the back of my neck, and I snapped forward, choking on a scream. My entire body went rigid, paralyzed with fear, as though the sensation had frozen me in place. No. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. A voice. It wasn't the laughter this time. It was something worse. Soft. Too soft. Whispering directly into my ear. You thought you were awake, didn't you? I stumbled forward, my legs shaking as I fought to regain control of my body. But I could feel it. The air was thicker now, pressing down on me, crushing me. I couldn't see what was behind me, but I could feel the presence, the weight of it pressing against my back. It was waiting for something, like a predator waiting to strike. This is it, I thought. I'm not getting out of this. I forced myself to turn around, my body moving against my will. And there it was. A figure. A shadow. But it wasn't like before. This one was real. Or, at least, it felt real. Its shape was dark, looming, like it had been born from the very shadows themselves. But it wasn't entirely a shadow. I could see the outline of a person, a figure taller than any person should be, its limbs too long, too unnatural. And its face. I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop myself from staring at it, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. Its face was familiar. Too familiar. It was a twisted reflection of my own. The eyes were the same, hollow, dark, wide open. But there was something wrong with it. Its grin was too wide, stretching across its face like it wanted to consume the very air around it. You don't belong here, it whispered, and the voice was my own. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could run, if I could fight. My legs were like lead, too heavy to move. The figure in front of me wasn't just a thing in the shadows. It was the shadow. It was everything I feared. It was me. You belong with me. The words came out like a command, and something inside of me shattered. I turned and ran, not even knowing where I was going, just trying to escape. I ran, but the walls were closing in. The hallway stretched too long, like it was bending and shifting. I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick. The shadows were swallowing me whole. The pounding in my chest was deafening. I didn't know where I was anymore. The hallway had stretched and twisted beyond recognition, becoming a labyrinth of endless, dark corridors. The walls were too close, pressing on me like they were alive, like they were aware. The faint smell of rust had turned into something sharper, metallic and sour, making my stomach churn with every breath. I ran. I had to run. There was no other choice. But the more I moved, the more the house felt like it was shifting, warping around me. The doors that had once been there were gone, replaced by more walls, and the windows, why were the windows covered? I couldn't see the outside world anymore. I was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare of my own making. The figure. The thing. It had been there, following me, just out of sight. I could feel it, its presence pressing against me from all sides. The whispering voice, the voice that was me, was still in my head, crawling under my skin, wrapping around my thoughts. You belong with me. I couldn't get rid of it. The words echoed in my mind, a constant hum, a pulse that throbbed like a drumbeat. I belong with it. What did that even mean? Was it a warning? A truth? The darkness seemed to swallow every trace of light. The house was no longer a home, it had become something else. Something ancient and hollow. It groaned like it was alive, as if it was reacting to me, responding to my fear. I stumbled, my legs giving way beneath me, and I crashed to the floor. My hands scraped against the cold, rough surface, and I felt the burning sting of broken skin. But there was no time to feel the pain. There was only the urgency of getting away, of escaping whatever was following me, watching me. My breath came in ragged gasps, too fast, too shallow, but it didn't matter. I had to keep moving. I had to. No. A voice, sharp and clear. It wasn't mine. Stop. I froze. The voice wasn't inside my head. It was real. It was coming from somewhere in the darkness, but I couldn't tell where. It wasn't the voice of the figure. It wasn't the voice that had haunted me. Stop running. I slowly turned, dread coiling in my stomach like a serpent. The air was thick, oppressive, suffocating. My fingers curled into the rough carpet, my nails digging into the fibers, grounding me in the moment. I didn't want to face whatever was behind me, but I had no choice. The figure. It was standing there now, in front of me, blocking the only exit, the only way out. Its silhouette was clear now, taller, more solid. But there was something wrong with it. Its features were sharp, too sharp. Its limbs too long. Its hands were twisted, fingers bent in unnatural angles. And the face. The face was mine, but twisted, stretched in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It smiled at me, but it wasn't a smile. It was something much worse, something hollow, something empty. The eyes were black voids, with no light, no depth, just endless, consuming darkness. You can't run from yourself. The voice was like a knife cutting through the air, sharp and cold. It wasn't just the figure speaking anymore. It was the house. It was me. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. My thoughts were fragmented, scattered across the floor like broken glass. I couldn't make sense of anything anymore. What was real? What was I? The figure stepped closer, its long limbs moving in a way that wasn't human. It glided across the floor, its feet barely touching the ground. Each movement was deliberate, measured, like it was savoring every step. It didn't need to run. It didn't need to hurry. It was the house. It was me. I had always been here. The words echoed, bouncing off the walls. My mind screamed in protest, but it was too late. The figure reached out, its long, cold fingers brushing against my cheek. You are mine now. I wanted to pull away, but my body was frozen, my limbs stiff with fear. I could feel the chill of its touch seep into my skin, deeper and deeper, like ice spreading through my veins. My heart raced. My pulse thundered in my ears. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, smiling, watching me, as if waiting for something. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know what it needed from me. But I already knew. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The mirror. The reflection. It had never been a reflection at all. It had always been me, waiting for this moment, waiting for me to finally understand. To finally realize that I had never escaped. I never would. The house was a prison. The shadows were its walls, and I was trapped inside them, locked in a place where time didn't exist. Where nothing was real, except for the fear, except for the thing that had been following me all along. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was my reality. And there was no waking up. It was always there, in the morning light. The reflection. That shadow. I never noticed it at first. How could I? After all, it was just the usual morning routine: brush my teeth, fix my hair, stare into the mirror. But then, one day, something shifted. Something changed. And now, every time I look at it, I can't unsee it. It started as an outline, barely noticeable at first. A ripple in the glass, a distortion in the reflection, something that wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the lighting, maybe the angle, maybe just my imagination. But then, it wasn't. I had always prided myself on my sharp attention to detail. I noticed everything. So why hadn't I seen it before? Why hadn't anyone? The first morning it happened, I thought it was just the usual haze of sleepiness clouding my mind. I'd woken up late, the sunlight harsh against my face, my hands fumbling as I grabbed the toothpaste and brushed my teeth in a daze. But as I looked into the mirror, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something was off. A shadow moved in the corner of my reflection. I blinked. It was gone. I shook my head, laughed at myself, telling myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light. But then it came back. And this time, it wasn't just a shadow. There was a figure, no, a presence, standing at the edge of the mirror, just outside my peripheral vision. I could see it now, clearer, more defined. It was there, but not there. Its outline shimmered, like smoke caught in the glass, and when I blinked again, it was gone. I wiped my face, trying to shake off the unease. I couldn't make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Was it the stress of work or the exhaustion of the past few weeks? But the next morning, it was there again. I leaned closer to the mirror, staring harder. The figure was still there, just a flicker at the edge, but more distinct now. A woman. Or at least, the outline of one. Her face was blurry, indistinct, like it was smeared on the glass. She was always there, but never fully in focus. I could never make out her features, but I felt her watching me. I felt her presence. There was something familiar about her, and that was the worst part. I didn't know who she was, yet I felt like I had known her forever. Days passed, and the figure didn't fade. It only grew stronger. It wasn't just the reflection that changed. The house started to change too. At first, it was subtle, little things out of place, a light flickering when it shouldn't, the smell of something faintly burning, like incense, lingering in the air for hours. Then, I started hearing things. Soft whispers, low murmurs, barely audible at first. At night, I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that was never quite silent. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing with me. The creaking of floorboards, the slow, rhythmic tapping of pipes behind the walls. But there was something else too. Something I couldn't quite place. Something darker, deeper. And every time I looked into the mirror, the figure was there. Waiting. I started to dread the mornings. Each time I would step into the bathroom, my eyes would be drawn to the glass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The moment my gaze hit the mirror, the figure would be there, staring back at me. Watching, waiting. Her face, still blurry, still shifting, was slowly beginning to take shape. But I couldn't quite make it out. Every time I tried, the reflection seemed to shift again, distorting into something else. I had to know. I had to understand. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror, trembling. I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by a mix of fear and curiosity. And then, for a split second, I saw it. The figure smiled. Not a gentle smile, but something twisted, something dark. And for that brief, horrifying moment, I saw her face clearly. It was me. But it wasn't me. Her smile stretched too wide, too unnatural. Her eyes were empty, hollow. And when she tilted her head, I saw it. A faint scar running down her neck. A scar I recognized. It was mine. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stepped back from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, memories flooding in, swirling in a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. I turned away, desperate to escape. But I knew, deep down, that the figure wouldn't go away. It couldn't. It was me, and I couldn't outrun it. The memories started coming back, ones I had buried so deep, I thought I'd forgotten them forever. The fire, the screaming, the glass shattering. I had never told anyone about it. I had tried to forget, to move on, to pretend like it never happened. But now, the past was coming for me. And it was staring back at me in the mirror. I couldn't escape it. The reflection, my reflection, had become my only reality. At night, I'd try to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Her empty eyes. That twisted smile. The scar. And every time I tried to forget, to move past it, I was pulled back into the memory, the fire, the screams. I tried to rationalize it. I convinced myself that it was just stress, just exhaustion. Maybe I was imagining things. After all, I'd been working too hard. Long hours, sleepless nights. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. But I knew deep down that it wasn't just that. I knew something was wrong. Something beyond the realm of logic. Something that lived in the shadows of my past. The whispers grew louder. I could hear them in the silence of the night, in the corners of my apartment. Soft, unintelligible sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. My pulse quickened every time I heard them, and my heart would race. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of something unseen. I began to feel her presence in the room with me, even when I wasn't looking in the mirror. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my vision, just a flicker, a shadow that wasn't quite right. I'd turn, but nothing would be there. And then the smell started. At first, it was faint, like burnt wood or ash, but it lingered. It wasn't like any scent I'd ever encountered. It clung to the air, heavy and thick, like a memory too strong to forget. I tried to ignore it. I tried to go about my days, as if everything were normal. I forced myself to work, to focus. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped looking in mirrors, stopped looking at my reflection. I thought if I ignored it, if I pretended it wasn't there, it would go away. But the reflection didn't need my attention to exist. It was always there, waiting, watching. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. I needed to get away from the apartment, away from the suffocating feeling that something was watching me. The city streets were crowded, but I felt as if I were walking alone in a sea of strangers, as if the world around me had faded into the background. I couldn't escape it. It was the mirror. I could still see her in my mind. I could still hear her voice, whispering just beneath the surface. And the scar on her neck that mirrored mine. I hadn't realized it at first, but now it was impossible to ignore. Why was it there? Why did it look like something I had once tried to forget? I tried to shake the thought, but it clung to me like a sickness in my veins. The deeper I dug into my own memories, the more I realized that the reflection wasn't just a coincidence. It was connected to something I had buried long ago. I returned home that evening, the weight of my thoughts heavy on my shoulders. As I stepped into the apartment, I felt the familiar chill that had settled in my bones. The silence was deafening. The air, thick with the same smell of burnt wood, seemed to press in on me from all sides. I stepped into the bathroom, bracing myself. The mirror was there, waiting. I closed my eyes, refusing to look at it. But I knew it would be there, even without me looking. I opened my eyes. And there it was. The reflection. Her. But this time, something was different. The figure wasn't standing at the edge of the mirror anymore. It was closer. Too close. I could see her clearly now. Her face, twisted and contorted, just as I remembered. But now, I could see something else. Her eyes were locked on mine, unblinking, unfeeling. Her mouth, twisted in that awful, unnatural grin, moved. Slowly, deliberately. It was as if she were speaking. But there was no sound. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My breath quickened. I tried to look away, to break the connection, but I couldn't. I felt paralyzed, trapped in her gaze. I had to move, I had to leave. But my body wouldn't respond. The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. I stepped back, my hands shaking, my knees weak. The room around me seemed to warp, as if the walls were closing in, shrinking, like I was suffocating. Suddenly, the reflection's smile faded. Her eyes seemed to widen, as if something had clicked in her mind. And then, I saw it. The scar. It was moving. The scar on her neck, my scar, was shifting. It was twisting, stretching, as if something beneath it was alive, something trying to break free. The mirror cracked. Not in a dramatic, shattering way, It cracked slowly, silently. A thin, jagged line ran down the center, splitting the reflection in two. And that's when I saw it. Behind her. Something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. It was dark, almost like a shadow, but more solid. It was tall, looming, with long, outstretched arms that reached out from the cracks in the mirror. It moved toward me, and I could feel the air grow colder, thicker, as it inched closer. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the reflection. The figure standing just behind me in the mirror, her twisted grin, her hollow, lifeless eyes. I paced around my apartment like a caged animal, my hands trembling, my thoughts scattered. It felt as if the walls themselves were breathing, closing in on me. The shadows that hung from every corner of the room seemed to shift with every flicker of the dim light. The smell of burnt wood still lingered, sharp and sickening, as if the very air had been tainted by whatever was happening in the mirror. I tried to force myself to think logically. This isn't real. You're just tired. It's stress. Nothing more. But every time I tried to convince myself, I was pulled back to that moment, back to the crack in the mirror, the shadow looming in the reflection, reaching out toward me. I couldn't escape it. I was losing control. I could feel it in my bones, the way the room seemed to warp around me. The mirror. I had to destroy it. I had to break it. But I was terrified of what would happen if I did. What if the thing in the mirror was real? What if destroying it meant destroying myself? But what if it wasn't just a mirror? What if it was more than that? I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, not thinking, just moving, desperate to escape the suffocating feeling that was crawling under my skin. The streets were quiet, the usual hum of the city replaced by an eerie stillness. The pavement felt cold beneath my feet, the distant sound of traffic muted by the thick fog that clung to the air. I wandered aimlessly, my mind racing. My heart kept beating in my throat, a constant reminder that I couldn't outrun the fear that had settled deep within me. Every shadow seemed to watch me, every whisper of the wind felt like fingers brushing against my skin. I could almost hear her voice, soft and low, just beyond my hearing. Get a grip, I told myself. You're being irrational. It's just a reflection. It's not real. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I made my way to a nearby cafe, hoping the noise and the crowd would bring me some comfort. I needed to be around people. I needed to feel normal again, to escape the madness that was consuming me. Inside, the cafe was bustling with life, people chatting, the sound of coffee machines steaming milk, the clink of spoons against mugs. But none of it felt real. It all felt distant, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. The world outside the window seemed muted, as if everything was happening just beyond my reach. I sat down at a table by the window and tried to focus on the menu in front of me, but the words blurred together. All I could see was the reflection in the glass. The faint outline of my own face staring back at me, twisted and distorted by the condensation. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. I turned back to the window, but something was different. The reflection was no longer just my face. It was something more. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, it was there, her. The same twisted grin. The same hollow eyes. The same scar on her neck, stretching and twisting beneath the surface. No. No, no, no. I jumped to my feet, knocking the chair back. The room seemed to spin around me, the sound of laughter and conversation becoming distant, muffled. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with panic. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I ran out of the cafe, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold night air hit my face, but it didn't help. I could still feel her presence, lurking just behind me, just out of sight. I had to go home. I had to break the mirror. I had to destroy whatever it was that was haunting me. I stumbled back into my apartment, the darkness wrapping around me like a shroud. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me from every side. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. The reflection was waiting for me, just like before. But this time, there was something different. The crack in the glass had spread. It ran down the length of the mirror now, jagged and uneven, like a wound that was still bleeding. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, and the smell of burnt wood was stronger, sharper. I could see her more clearly now. She was smiling, no, grinning. That twisted, unnatural grin that seemed to stretch wider and wider with every passing second. Her eyes locked with mine. And then, her lips moved. There was no sound, but I heard her clearly in my mind, as if she were speaking directly to me. You can't escape me. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, as if they didn't belong to me anymore. The reflection's smile faded, and something darker, something deeper, took its place. Her eyes darkened, becoming hollow, empty, like black voids that reached into my soul. She stepped forward, closer to the glass. The crack in the mirror widened, spreading like a disease. And then, I saw it. The shadow. The thing behind her. It was watching me. It was real. It was coming for me. I reached out, my fingers grazing the mirror's surface. The moment I touched it, a chill shot through my body, and the world around me shattered. The room was spinning. The mirror shattered before my eyes, its jagged pieces falling to the floor like 1,000 sharp knives. For a brief, fleeting moment, the silence felt almost sacred, like time had stopped, as if the world had been momentarily paused. But it was a lie. It never stopped. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my mind a jumble of panic and confusion. The broken glass reflected fragments of me, my face twisted with fear, my eyes wide, searching for anything, for anyone, to make sense of what I had just witnessed. She's gone. It's gone. I tried to convince myself. I looked at the remnants of the mirror, each shard glinting in the dim light, a distorted version of the world, like a broken reality I could never put back together. I stepped back slowly, my gaze still glued to the shards. The quiet buzz in my ears started to fade as my heartbeat roared in my chest. But the oppressive feeling didn't disappear. The air was thick with something. A presence. A weight. It pressed down on me, suffocating me. And then I heard it. A sound. Soft. Almost imperceptible. Scrape. It was faint, but it was there. I whipped my head around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The apartment felt different, strange, wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than they should have been. The floorboards creaked underfoot, but not like they usually did. This wasn't the sound of old wood settling. This was deliberate. Scrape. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing. No movement. Nothing to explain what I was hearing. My breath quickened. My mind raced. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady myself. But the sound, it came again. Louder this time. More distinct. Scrape. It was coming from the direction of the bedroom. I didn't want to go there. My legs didn't want to move. I could feel the cold sweat forming on my skin, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I knew, deep down, that whatever was happening, whatever she was, it wasn't over. I had thought breaking the mirror would stop it. But it didn't. My body moved before my mind could catch up. My feet carried me to the bedroom door. The silence that followed me was suffocating. I grabbed the handle, but it didn't turn. I twisted it again, harder this time, my hand shaking violently. And then the door opened, creaking on its hinges. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a bedroom anymore. The room had changed. The walls had started to close in, and the air was thick, heavy with the smell of something burning. It wasn't the pleasant, familiar scent of incense or the usual freshness of the place. It was bitter, like something had rotted away in the corners of the room. The bed, the one I had slept in so many times before, was now covered in thick, black vines that crawled and twisted, wrapping around the furniture like some dark, sentient growth. And there, at the foot of the bed, she stood. The reflection. Her figure was almost indistinguishable from the shadows themselves. The dim light from the broken window barely illuminated her, but I could see her features clearly, her empty, hollow eyes, her twisted smile stretching unnaturally wide. Her face was pale, sickly, like something that had been dead for too long. She wasn't smiling at me this time. She was staring at me. I could feel her gaze burning through me, cutting straight to the core of my being. Scrape. The sound came again, louder now, like fingernails dragging across glass. It was her movement, but it wasn't normal. Her arms, elongated and unnaturally thin, twitched and jerked as she reached out for me. The fingers, they were wrong. They twisted at impossible angles, stretching, scraping at the air around her. I could feel the air grow colder with each second that passed. The room felt like it was suffocating me, like it was becoming a part of her, part of whatever she was. She wasn't just in the mirror anymore. She was in my world. No, I thought desperately. This isn't real. It can't be. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was real. She was real. And there was nowhere left to hide. Her hand reached out, and I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. For a moment, everything around me blurred, as though the world had been dipped in dark ink. And then, just as her fingers were inches from my skin, there was a loud crack, like thunder, splitting the air in half. The sound of glass shattering again. But it wasn't the mirror this time. It was the floor beneath me. The ground itself seemed to split open, a massive crack running down the center of the room, like a wound in the earth, a wound in reality itself. The air around me was thick with a noise now, screeching, like metal scraping on stone. The reflection, it was gone. For a moment, there was only silence. But I knew it wasn't over. It was never over. I took a step back, then another, my heart racing, my mind screaming for escape. But as I turned toward the door, I felt it again, the pressure, the weight, the sense that something was behind me, watching me. And when I looked over my shoulder, the room wasn't empty. There was someone standing there, just out of reach. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. She was behind me. The room was suffocating. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, but there was no escape from the oppressive heaviness pressing down on me. I turned slowly, terrified to look behind me again, but I knew I couldn't stop myself. The figure was still there. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. No human could move the way she did, twisting and jerking, her limbs elongating at impossible angles, her head tilting at a grotesque angle that made my stomach lurch. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. My body was paralyzed, caught between the desperate need to flee and the crushing weight of fear that held me in place. Her hollow eyes locked with mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. Her gaze was suffocating. It burrowed deep into my soul, like she was reaching inside me, pulling out every hidden fear, every suppressed memory I had tried to forget. My heart pounded, and my palms were slick with sweat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. She knows me. She knows everything about me. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This wasn't just some random nightmare or hallucination. This was personal. She was tied to me, to my memories. She knew every secret I'd buried deep within myself. Every mistake. Every regret. Every piece of pain I had hidden from the world. Her twisted smile widened as if she could hear my thoughts. She was hearing them. My mind screamed for me to move, to run, to do anything to escape, but my legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. My pulse thundered in my ears, drying out everything else, until all that was left was her. And the mirror. I glanced back toward the shattered fragments, the scattered glass gleaming ominously in the dim light. The shards reflected the room, but not right. Some of them held images that didn't belong. Her face was there, staring at me from the glass, her features twisted and wrong. She was no longer confined to the reflections. She was inside me now. A sudden crash broke the tension, and I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. My breath caught in my chest as I watched a dresser near the bed begin to slide across the floor on its own. The scraping sound of wood against stone filled the room, unnerving in its deliberate pace. I took a step back, but my body was still unwilling to obey, still frozen in fear. The dresser halted abruptly, and the room grew still. The air felt thick with anticipation. Something was coming. I didn't know what, but it was coming. The figure in front of me, her twisted again, her body bending in unnatural directions. Her fingers dragged across the floor, scraping the wood as she slowly, methodically, began to move toward me. Each movement was deliberate, like she was savoring my fear. The dark silhouette of her form loomed closer, and I finally managed to move. My legs screamed as I pushed them into motion, and I turned to run, my mind screaming at my body to keep going, to not look back. I stumbled across the room, nearly tripping over the broken glass, but I didn't dare stop. I had to get out. I had to leave this place, this nightmare. My breath was ragged, my chest tight, but I forced myself to move faster. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the handle. My eyes flickered to the hallway beyond, the dim lights offering no comfort. I could hear the scrape of her nails against the wood, so close now, but I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel her presence creeping closer, like something shadowing my every step. I have to go. I have to get out. I wrenched the door open, practically throwing myself into the hallway. I didn't know where I was running. It didn't matter. I just needed to escape, to put as much distance between me and the horror that was following me. The sound of her moving echoed behind me, almost faster now, like she was gaining on me. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to go, the hallways twisted, warped, and distorted before my eyes. It was like the house itself was alive, stretching and shifting, trapping me in a maze with no way out. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, closing in around me. My heart was in my throat as I turned corner after corner, each one leading me deeper into the labyrinth of my own fear. I stumbled into a room, another one I didn't recognize, and slammed the door shut behind me. My chest was heaving, my breath shallow and erratic. My eyes frantically searched the room for something, anything, that could help. The only light came from a single lamp, flickering as if it were about to go out. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, there was a mirror, but it wasn't the same as the one I had shattered. This one was different. Older. The glass was fogged over, and the frame was cracked, like it had been there for years, forgotten. And yet, there it was, reflecting the room behind me. But it wasn't right. The reflection wasn't just me. I could see her in it. Her twisted figure stood behind me, her arms outstretched, fingers reaching toward me from the mirror, like she was trying to pull herself free from it. She wasn't confined to the glass anymore. She was in the reflection. She was everywhere. The room tilted again, and I felt the floor beneath me give way. My vision blurred, and I staggered, struggling to keep my balance. The reflection moved closer, stretching its shadow over the room. I was trapped again, trapped by her. And then I heard it. A voice, low and distorted. It didn't come from anywhere I could see, but I could hear it clear as day. You can't escape me. I am you. The room was closing in around me, the mirror's surface rippling like water, and I realized, with growing horror, that she wasn't just some ghost, some haunting apparition. She was me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.